How is solving equations used in Algebra 1? In Algebra 1, solving equations are simple. You are given a simple equation with constant and an x multiplied by numbers. These equations are referred to as one- and two-step equations and were the start of solving equations. Here is an example of a problem that may have been seen in Algebra 1. George has 12 apples. Trevor has 6 apples, and Trevor is also given 2 apples every day by his mother. How many days until Trevor will have the same amount of apples as George? The first thing you need to do is set the number of apples that George has, 12, equal to the number of apples that Trevor has, 6 plus the 2 his mother gives him every day. Then you go through and solve, and your answer ends up being x equals 3, which means it will be 3 days until Trevor and George have the same amount of apples. How is solving equations used in geometry? In geometry, solving equations is generally used in given formulas for certain shapes. Knowing how to solve equations, we could take any variable out of the formula and solve for it, and not just for the already isolated variable. Here is an example of where you might use solving equations in geometry. Robley is making a circular, caged area in her yard for Bandit to run around in. She goes to her good friend Kaufman for some leftover fence, and he gives her 50 meters of caging. What is the radius of the biggest circle Robley can make with the fence Kaufman gave her? For this problem, you're going to need the circumference of a circle, which is c equals 2 pi r. Then you're going to plug in the values you are given. We know the circumference needs to be 50, so we plug in 50 for c. Then you're going to solve 50 equals 2 pi r, and you get 25 over pi equals r, the radius. So with this, we know that Robley can make a circle with a radius of 25 over pi meters, or about 7.957 meters. Solving equations used in Algebra 2. In Algebra 2, solving and simplifying equations becomes much more advanced. Students are asked to solve inequalities, systems of equations, and quadratic equations by factoring. Solving quadratic equations through factoring gets more in-depth by learning techniques like completing the square. Students also learn how to solve radical equations and inequalities, as well as logarithmic equations and inequalities. Here's an example of how solving equations is used in Algebra 2. A coffee merchant has 2 types of coffee beans, one selling for $9 per pound and the other for $15 per pound. The beans are to be mixed to provide 100 pounds of a mixture selling for $13.50 per pound. How much of each toffee bean should be used to form 100 pounds of the mixture? The unknowns are the amounts of the 2 types of coffee beans. We must now establish a system of 2 equations. One of the equations will be based on the total amount, and the other based on the mixture's value. The first equation represents that the mixture must weigh 100 pounds. The second equation represents the value of the $9 beans and the value of the $15 beans to equal the total value. Using these 2 equations, we take the first equation and multiply it by 9. Then we can subtract the 2 equations to simplify it down to 1. We get 6y equals 400 pounds. We can then solve for y, and we get y equals 75 pounds. We take the value y equals 75 pounds and plug it back into the first equation to solve for x. We then get x equals 25 pounds. You may check your answers by plugging these values into either of the equations. How is solving equations used in pre-calculus? In pre-calc, we would often use solving equations with trig functions. Also, we would use it with logarithms and exponential functions. Here is an example of how solving equations would be used in pre-calculus. Solve e to the 2x plus 3 equals 5. In this problem, to simplify it, you must take the natural log of both sides. Then, the natural log of e is canceled out because the natural log of e is 1. You can then simplify and solve for the value of x. How is solving equations used in calculus? In calc, we use solving equations usually with integrating. This is used when we are trying to find the constant needed to make an integral true. Here is an example of how we would use solving equations in calculus. Find y in terms of x when dy dx equals 3x squared plus 4x plus 5 when y of 2 equals 5. To solve for y, we must take the integral of each side. Once we have found the antiderivative, we need to make sure to add plus c to the end of the equation to find the constant that makes the equation true. We then plug in our y of 2 equals 5 into the equation and solve for c, getting our answer to be y equals x cubed plus 2x squared plus 5x minus 21. Why do we need to know how to solve equations? Solving equations is taught to students early on as it is fundamental to the advancement and expansion of knowledge in math. Without solving equations, we would not be able to solve for simple unknown variables all the way through solving for the constant of an integral.